The day my husband's father came to the funeral, he offered to pay off every cent of the gambling debt that killed him. He said he just wanted his son's old business files, a final memento. But when I found the contract hidden between the pages of a dusty ledger, I realized he wasn't there to pay a debt, he was there to collect on it. The stale, cloying scent of lilies still clung to my clothes, a funeral parlor perfume I couldn't seem to wash away. It had been a week since I found Ethan, a week since my world had imploded, leaving behind a crater of grief and a mountain of debt that felt just as suffocating. I was going through the motions, breathing, eating, sleeping in our cold, empty bed, but none of it felt real. The only thing that felt real was the gut-wrenching shame. Shame for him, for me, for not seeing how bad it had gotten. Ethan was a good man. I need you to know that. He was warm where his father was ice, kind where the world was cruel. He had this laugh that started in his belly and just erupted, a sound that could make the worst day feel manageable. But he had a sickness, a demon that whispered sweet nothings about odds and sure things. A gambling addiction that he fought, tooth and nail, for years. We went to meetings, we saw therapists, we cut up credit cards and put blocks on his accounts. There were good stretches, months, even a whole year once, where he was clean. We thought he'd beaten it. But the demon always found a way back in, and this last time, it had dragged him so far down he couldn't see a way back up. So when William Sterling, Ethan's father, approached me at the wake, I was prepared for a lecture. I was prepared for the I told you so that had been hanging in the air between us for the entire decade I'd known his son. William was a man carved from granite and ambition, a CEO who saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities. His son, in his eyes, had always been a liability. He stood there in his impeccably tailored $1,000 suit, a stark contrast to the rest of us in our somber, off-the-rack grief. His eyes, the same shade of steel blue as Ethan's but utterly devoid of their warmth, swept over me with an expression that was less sympathy and more assessment. "Sophia," he said, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. "A tragedy. A waste of potential." He didn't say he was sorry for my loss. He didn't say he'd miss his only son. He spoke of Ethan like a failed investment. I just nodded, my throat too tight to form words. I was holding a lukewarm cup of coffee, and my hands were trembling. "I'm aware of the financial situation Ethan has left you in," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "The vultures will be circling soon, I imagine. Loan sharks, creditors. It will be unpleasant." He wasn't wrong. The calls had already started. Men with gravelly voices who didn't care that my husband was dead, only that he owed them. The numbers they threw around made me feel sick. More money than I'd ever seen, more than the value of our small house, my car, everything we owned combined. I was drowning. "I want to make you an offer," William said, his tone purely transactional. "I will settle every one of Ethan's outstanding debts. Every last penny. You will be free of it. A clean slate." I stared at him, stunned into silence. This was the man who cut Ethan off years ago, who called his son's addiction a moral failing and refused to lend him a dime for a legitimate business idea, let alone a bailout. The whiplash of his offer was dizzying. "Why?" I finally managed to whisper. A flicker of something, was it irritation? Impatience? Crossed his face before it settled back into a neutral mask. "Let's just call it a father's final responsibility. There is, however, a small condition." Of course there was. Men like William Sterling didn't do anything for free. Ethan kept records from his old ventures. Before all this, he gestured vaguely, as if the last decade of his son's struggle was a distasteful mess he couldn't be bothered to name. Particularly that tech startup he tried to get off the ground. He stored everything in a unit off the interstate. I want those files. The ledgers, the business plans, the investor contacts. Consider them sentimental. Sentimental. William Sterling had all the sentimentality of a spreadsheet. It didn't make any sense. Why would he want the records of a failed business from 8 years ago? A business he'd openly mocked and refused to support. But I was in no position to question his motives. He was offering me a lifeline, a way out of the suffocating debt that was crushing the air from my lungs. It was a chance to actually grieve my husband without the terror of losing my home. He told me he threw all that stuff out, I said, my mind racing. He didn't, William stated with absolute certainty. He was a pack rat. He never threw anything away. The unit is in his name. The keys should be in his desk. He slipped a platinum business card from his pocket and placed it on the table beside me. My lawyer's number is on there. Have him draw up the paperwork to transfer the debt to my accounts. Once that's done and I have the files, the matter will be closed. He gave me one last, cool look, then turned and walked away, a ghost of immense power who had materialized just long enough to rearrange my universe. I looked down at the card, at the crisp, embossed lettering. It felt like a deal with the devil. But the devil was offering to save me. That night, after everyone had gone and the house was achingly quiet, I found the keys exactly where he said they'd be, tucked in the back of Ethan's desk drawer, on a goofy keychain from a vacation we took to Florida. Hope, for the first time in a week, felt like a possibility. A dangerous, fragile possibility. I decided to go to the storage unit the next day. I just wanted it to be over. I wanted the files, the debt, the whole nightmare gone, so I could be left alone with the memory of the man I loved. The man I thought I knew. The storage facility was one of those sprawling, soulless places on the edge of town, a grid of identical, roll-up metal doors baking in the sun. It smelled of dust and hot asphalt. I fumbled with the key, the metallic scrape and clank of the lock echoing in the silence. The door groaned in protest as I heaved it upwards, revealing a 10 by 10-foot cavern of forgotten things. William was right. Ethan had been a pack rat. The unit was a time capsule of our life together. Stacked boxes of college textbooks sat next to a wobbly nightstand from our first apartment. My old painting easel, which I hadn't touched in years, was leaning against a wall, draped in a dusty sheet. In the corner, I saw the ridiculous inflatable Santa we could never bring ourselves to throw away. A wave of grief, so powerful it buckled my knees, washed over me. Every object held a ghost. Every box was a memory I wasn't ready to face. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing in the stale air, tears streaming down my face. This was where dreams came to die. I wiped my eyes on my sleeve and forced myself to focus. I needed to find those business records. The sooner I got them, the sooner this pact with William would be fulfilled. The sooner I could breathe. The boxes were labeled in Ethan's familiar, slightly messy scrawl: kitchen stuff, winter clothes, photos. Towards the back, I saw a stack of bankers' boxes, all meticulously labeled Sterling Innovations. That was it. That was the startup. The one he poured his heart and soul into before the gambling took over completely. He'd been so full of passion back then, so certain he was going to change the world with his app. Seeing the name of his failed company written in his own hand felt like a fresh wound. I pulled the top box down, the cardboard groaning under the weight. I pried open the flaps and was met with the dry, papery smell of old files. It was exactly what William had described: business plans bound in cheap plastic covers, stacks of invoices, and half a dozen thick, green accounting ledgers. It felt like an archaeological dig into a life that no longer existed. I sat on the cold concrete floor, pulling out the ledgers one by one. They were filled with columns of numbers, a language I didn't understand, chronicling the slow, painful death of my husband's dream. I almost missed it. I was on the third ledger, my fingers dusty and my resolve waning. As I flipped a page, a thicker, folded document that had been tucked deep within the spine slipped out and landed in my lap. It wasn't a part of the ledger. The paper was different, a heavy, creamy cardstock, the kind used for legal documents. It was folded into thirds. My first thought was that it was an old lease or some other forgotten piece of business admin. But when I unfolded it, the words at the top of the page made the air leave my lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp. Partnership and profit sharing agreement. That wasn't right. Sterling Innovations was Ethan's company. He was the sole founder. He'd lamented for years that he could never find a partner who believed in his vision, least of all his own father. My eyes scanned down the page, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs with a frantic, sickening rhythm. There were two names listed under the parties section. Party A, Ethan Sterling. Party B, William Sterling. My blood ran cold. William had been a partner. He'd always maintained he wanted nothing to do with it. He'd called it a vanity project. Ethan had begged him for a loan, and he'd laughed in his face. Why would he lie? Why would Ethan lie? I kept reading, my hands shaking so badly the words swam before my eyes. The agreement was dated just before Ethan's gambling had spiraled out of control for the very first time. The document outlined the terms of their venture. It spoke of capital investments and profit splits, but the language was strange, coded. It didn't talk about app development or user acquisition. It talked about strategic social engagements, risk assessment at high-stakes tables, and leveraging targeted reputational damage against competitors. It was corporate jargon, but in a context that made no sense for a tech startup. Then I saw it. Tucked into a subclause in Section 3, a single sentence that rewrote the past 10 years of my life. It described Party A's role to engage specified individuals in games of chance, utilizing capital provided by Party B, with the express purpose of creating significant financial distress for the targets. And then, the final, brutal clause, all winnings generated from these engagements are to be considered business profits, to be split 80/20 in favor of Party B. It wasn't a business plan. It was a contract. My husband's addiction, the disease I had supported him through, the shame that had eaten him alive and driven him to his death, it wasn't a disease. It was a job, a dirty, calculated business arrangement with his own father. Ethan wasn't a gambling addict. He was a weapon. And the winnings weren't lost to a sickness. They were laundered, collected, and deposited into William's accounts. This whole time, the man I married wasn't fighting a demon. He was working for one. I sat there on the cold, dusty concrete of the storage unit, the contract trembling in my hands and the world tilted on its axis. The air grew thin, and a high-pitched ringing started in my ears. Every memory of the past decade was rushing at me, reframing itself through this horrific new lens. It was like watching a movie of my own life, but now I could see the monster that had been lurking in the background of every scene. All those frantic, late-night calls when Ethan would tell me he'd slipped up. The shame in his eyes, the self-loathing in his voice as he confessed to losing thousands of dollars we didn't have. I would hold him, tell him it was okay, that it was the disease talking, not him. But it was all a performance. A meticulously rehearsed lie. He wasn't confessing to a weakness, he was reporting on a business loss. The shame was real, I think, but not for the reasons I believed. It wasn't the shame of an addict. It was the shame of a man who'd sold his soul. And William, my God, William. His cold disapproval, his lectures on responsibility, his constant disappointment in his son. It was all a cover. He wasn't a distant, estranged father. He was a silent partner, the puppet master pulling the strings. He hadn't abandoned his son, he had weaponized him. He'd found Ethan's one weakness, that thrill-seeking edge he'd always had, and instead of helping him, he'd cultivated it, monetized it. He'd turned his own child into a tool to ruin his business rivals. I thought back to news I'd half heard over the years, a competitor of Williams suddenly declaring bankruptcy, another one embroiled in a financial scandal after a disastrous investment. I'd never connected the dots. Now, I saw a string of bodies, of ruined lives, all leading back to a poker table where my husband sat, smiling his charming smile while he bled them dry for his father. My grief for the man I thought I'd lost curdled into something else. A white-hot, venomous rage. Rage at Ethan for the depth of his deception. He hadn't just lied about money, he had lied about who he was. He had let me sacrifice my savings, my career, my sanity, to support him in a fight that was never real. He'd made me his accomplice, an unwitting nurse in a staged illness. I felt like a fool, a prop in their twisted, decade-long play. But the rage I felt for Ethan was dwarfed by the black hole of hatred that opened up for William. He hadn't just used his son, he had systematically destroyed him. He'd fed the demon until it was big enough to consume Ethan entirely. And now I understood. Ethan's death wasn't a suicide born of shame from his addiction. It had to be a deal that went wrong. Maybe he lost too much. Maybe one of the targets fought back in a way they hadn't anticipated. Or maybe, just maybe, after all these years, Ethan finally couldn't live with what he'd become. His death wasn't a surrender to his demons, it was an escape from his devil of a father. And William's generous offer? The clean slate? It wasn't an act of paternal guilt. It was damage control. He wasn't here to bury his son, he was here to bury the evidence. This contract was the only thing connecting him to the scheme. He didn't want a memento. He wanted an incinerator. I folded the contract carefully, my movements stiff and robotic, and slipped it into my purse. My mind was a whirlwind of poison and pain. What was I supposed to do? Go to the police? What would I say? That a powerful, untouchable CEO ran a sophisticated money laundering scheme using his dead son as a proxy. They would laugh me out of the station. This contract was the only proof, and it would be my word, the word of a grieving, indebted widow, against a man with an army of lawyers who could bury me in legal fees until I was old and gray. And then there was William's offer. All that debt gone. A chance to start over, free and clear. It was blood money. It was the price of my silence. The price of letting him get away with destroying my husband. He was offering to pay me off with the very money Ethan had bled for him. The sheer, monstrous audacity of it stole my breath. He wasn't just covering his tracks, he was trying to make me a beneficiary of his crimes. He was trying to make me a silent partner, too. I drove home in a daze, the world outside my windshield looking warped and unfamiliar. The house felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary of shared memories, it was a crime scene. Every photo of Ethan and me seemed to mock me. Every object held the taint of his betrayal. I sat on our couch, the contract lying on the coffee table like a venomous snake. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my mind racing down 100 different paths, each one ending in a dark, impossible place. Risk everything for a justice I might never get, or take the money and live with the knowledge that I had let my husband's murderer walk free. My phone buzzed on the table, jolting me from my trance. The screen lit up with a name I never expected to see there. William Sterling. My heart leaped into my throat. I stared at the phone as it buzzed again, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent house. He was calling to see if I'd found his mementos. He was checking to see if his secret was safe. My hand hovered over the screen, my thumb shaking. He had all the power, all the money, all the control. But I had the truth. And for the first time, I realized that made me the most dangerous person in his world. I let the phone ring one more time before my hand, seemingly with a will of its own, swiped to answer. I pressed it to my ear, my own breathing sounding loud and ragged. Sophia, William's voice was as smooth and cold as polished marble. There was no preamble, no how are you holding up. Just business. I trust you had a productive trip to the storage unit. I swallowed, my mouth as dry as sand. I found the boxes, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I was amazed I could speak at all. Excellent. My courier can be at your house within the hour to collect them. The casual arrogance of it, the assumption that I was just a pawn to be moved, stoked the embers of my rage into a roaring fire. There's a problem with that, I said. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. A problem? I was under the impression our agreement was quite straightforward. It was, I replied, my eyes fixed on the contract lying on the table. But you weren't entirely straightforward with me, were you, William? You didn't just want the ledgers. You wanted what was inside of them. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than anything he could have said. I could almost hear the calculations whirring in his mind, the gears of his powerful brain assessing this new, unexpected variable. Me. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, but the silky confidence was gone. A brittle edge had crept into his voice. I think you do, I said, feeling a strange, dizzying sense of power. I'm looking at it right now. Partnership and profit sharing agreement. It's a fascinating document. Really paints a different picture of Ethan's illness. He didn't speak for a long moment. I could hear the faint sound of him breathing. When he finally did, his voice was low, menacing. A predator shedding its disguise. That is a private family matter. A misunderstanding. It has nothing to do with our arrangement. It has everything to do with it. I snapped, my composure finally breaking. This isn't a family matter, it's a crime scene. You didn't just use him, you destroyed him. You took your son and you hollowed him out until there was nothing left. His death isn't on him, William, it's on you. Be very careful, Sophia, he hissed. You're hysterical, grieving. You don't understand the world you're trying to step into. That piece of paper is meaningless. My lawyers will shred you, your reputation, and your husband's memory until there is nothing left but dust. Do you understand me? The threat was naked, brutal, and I believed every word of it. He could and would destroy me, but the fear was being crowded out by something else. A fierce, protective loyalty to the man Ethan should have been, the man he was before his father twisted him into a weapon. He deserved justice. He deserved for the truth to be told. Here's my counteroffer, I said, my voice shaking but resolute. Your original offer stands. You will pay every cent of the debt, just as you promised. You will transfer the funds to an account of my choosing within 24 hours. But you don't get the contract. You don't get the ledgers. You don't get anything. This contract becomes my insurance policy. It stays with me, in a very safe place. And you will leave me the hell alone for the rest of my life. If I ever hear from you again, if a single unexplained thing happens to me, a copy of this goes to every major news outlet in the country and every one of your business rivals. That's blackmail, he spat. No, I said, a bitter smile touching my lips. It's what you taught your son. It's business. An 80/20 split. You get your silence, and I get to live. Seems like a pretty good deal for you, considering. The line went dead. He didn't agree, but he didn't refuse. He had simply hung up. The silence that descended was absolute. For the rest of the day, I was a wreck, jumping at every sound, my heart pounding every time a car drove down my street. I had poked the bear. I had threatened one of the most powerful men in the city, and I had no idea what he would do next. I half expected a team of his lawyers to show up at my door, or worse. But the next morning, I woke up to an email. It was a wire transfer confirmation from my bank. The amount was staggering. Enough to clear all the debt, the mortgage, everything, with a significant amount left over. He had paid. He had taken the deal. A wave of relief so intense it made me lightheaded washed over me, followed immediately by a profound emptiness. I had won. I had survived. I had secured my future. But there was no triumph in it. I hadn't gotten justice for Ethan, not really. William was still out there, untouched, living in his glass tower, while my husband was in the ground. I had simply negotiated a better price for my silence. The ending to our story wasn't a blaze of righteous glory. It was a quiet, sterile bank transaction. I took the blood money. I paid off the debts and sold the house, unable to bear the ghosts that lingered in every room. I moved to a new city, trying to start a new life. But there's no such thing as a clean slate. Sometimes, late at night, I take out the contract. I read the words that signed my husband's death warrant. It's a reminder of the man I loved, the monster who created him, and the choice I made. I didn't expose him. I didn't risk it all for justice. I chose to live. And now I have to figure out if that was the right thing to do. So, tell me, what would you have done? Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. We appreciate everyone and can't wait to bring more stories your way.